There is a document that Soviet researchers never wanted the world to find. It was filed in 1947, buried under 3 layers of classification, stamped with a designation that translates roughly to biological anomaly, do not reproduce. For decades, it sat in an archive in Moscow, gathering dust alongside thousands of other forgotten horrors from the Stalin era. When the Soviet Union collapsed, when the KGB vaults cracked open and historians flooded in like water through a broken dam, most of what they found was mundane in its evil. Ledgers, execution orders, names crossed out in red ink. But this file was different. The researchers who first read it refused to discuss it publicly. One of them, a historian named in later accounts only as Dr. V, reportedly burned his notes. Another asked to be transferred to a different department entirely. A third simply said, when pressed by a journalist years later, "There are things a person should not know about what human beings are capable of." This is one of them. What happened in that sealed chamber in the winter of 1947 remains, to this day, one of the most disturbing accounts ever documented by the Soviet state. Not because of the gas they used, not because of the isolation, or the darkness, or the cold, because of what the subjects asked for when the researchers finally opened the door, and because of what they had done to themselves in the dark. Stay with me, because this story doesn't get easier. It only gets stranger and darker and more deeply, fundamentally wrong. To understand what happened, you first have to understand the world that made it possible. The war is over, but the Soviet Union is not at peace. Not internally, not psychologically, not politically. Stalin's grip on the country has tightened, if anything, in the years since victory. The NKVD, the secret police, operates with near total impunity. Scientists working under state contracts understand something that their counterparts in the West do not. Failure is not merely embarrassing. Failure can be fatal, and so they push. They push past ethical limits that Western science was only beginning to articulate. They push past the boundaries of what the human body is understood to be able to endure. They push because the state demands results, and the state does not tolerate excuses. The project begins, as so many of the worst projects in history do, with a question that sounds almost reasonable. What happens to human cognitive function under prolonged sleep deprivation? The Soviets had tactical reasons for wanting to know. A soldier who doesn't need sleep is a soldier who can march farther, fight longer, sustain operations that would break any conventional force. There were rumors, even then, about experimental stimulants being developed in German research facilities during the war. The Americans were said to be exploring similar territory. The Soviets could not afford to fall behind. But there was also something else driving the project. Something less strategic and more nakedly curious. A handful of researchers believed that sleep was not merely a biological necessity, but a psychological one. That consciousness, when deprived of its nightly reset, would eventually reveal something about itself. That the human mind, pushed far enough, might open up in ways that nothing else could produce. They wanted to know what was underneath. Underneath the personality, the identity, the socialized self. Underneath everything that makes a person recognizably human. They were about to find out. The subjects selected were 5 political prisoners. Men who had been convicted, or more accurately, accused, which in the Soviet system amounted to much the same thing, of crimes against the state. They were offered a deal: participate in the experiment, survive 30 days, and they would be granted full pardons and released. Given their alternatives, all 5 agreed. The chamber was prepared with considerable care. It was a sealed room, roughly the size of a large apartment, equipped with military-grade cots, a toilet, running water, and enough food to sustain 5 men for the duration of the experiment. Books were provided, paper and pens. The researchers were not cruel, or at least they told themselves they were not cruel. They were scientists. They wanted clean data. The key variable was an experimental gas, a stimulant compound, classified, Its precise formula still debated by researchers who've tried to reconstruct the experiment from partial records. It was designed to suppress the body's drive to sleep without producing the agitated, erratic behavior associated with conventional stimulants. In theory, the subjects would simply not sleep. They would remain awake, alert, functional for 30 days. In theory, the chamber was sealed. The gas began to flow. The researchers settled in to observe. For the first 5 days, everything was essentially normal. The subjects talked among themselves, read their books, ate their food, used the toilet, slept, or tried to. The gas made sleep difficult, but not impossible in the early stages. The subjects reported feeling restless, slightly euphoric, irritable. They asked the researchers via microphone when the experiment would end. They were told 25 more days. One of them laughed. One of them stopped talking. On the 5th day, the researchers noticed that the conversations between the subjects were changing, the topics becoming darker, more personal. 2 of the men began exchanging, through the intercom, what the researchers' notes describe as confessions, detailed, apparently voluntary accounts of crimes they had committed, things they had done, shameful memories they had never shared with anyone, not because they were coerced, simply because it seemed something in them needed to say it. The researchers found this curious. They noted it in their logs and continued to observe. By the 9th day, the confessions had stopped. In their place was something the researchers found considerably harder to categorize. Silence. Not the silence of sleeping men. The subjects were awake, provably, visibly awake, tracked by sensors monitoring movement and vital signs. But they had stopped talking, stopped reading, stopped eating in any purposeful way. They would stand or sit or lie on their cots and stare at the walls or the ceiling or nothing at all. And the only sounds coming from the chamber were the hum of the ventilation system, and occasionally something that the researchers initially logged as low vocalization, before eventually settling on a more honest description. Moaning, barely audible but constant, coming from all 5 subjects simultaneously, as if they had synchronized without meaning to, or without knowing they were doing it. One researcher who monitored the night shift during this period later described the sound as like something in terrible pain that had forgotten what pain was for. On the 11th day, one of the subjects, subject 3 in the official record, approached the microphone in the chamber and spoke for the first time in 2 days. He did not ask to leave. He did not report pain or distress. He did not ask any question that a person would normally think to ask. What he said was this: "We are what you made us. Do you understand that? We are exactly what you made us." Then he returned to his cot and did not speak again for 4 days. On the 10th day, something tore. It happened without clear precedent or immediate trigger. Subject 2, one of the quieter men, who had spent most of the 2nd week sitting motionless on his cot, stood up, walked to the center of the room, and screamed. Not a cry of pain, not a shout of rage or desperation. The researchers' notes are specific about this, and the specificity is what makes it disturbing. The scream was described as non-communicative, meaning it did not seem designed to convey anything, to attract attention, to express a need. It was simply sound. Raw, sustained, exhausting sound, the kind a body makes when language has stopped being adequate. He screamed for 3 minutes. Then he stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. He returned to his cot. He lay down. He stared at the ceiling. The other 4 subjects did not react, did not turn to look, did not speak, as if they had not heard. What happened over the next 6 days, the researchers would later describe with clinical precision in their reports and with considerably less precision in private. Several of them requested transfers during this period. At least one submitted a memo arguing that the experiment should be terminated. The memo was denied. Subject 1 began tearing pages from his books, not quickly or frantically, methodically, carefully, one page at a time. He would tear each page into precise strips and arrange them on the floor, around his cot in patterns that the researchers could not identify as meaningful, but that seemed to have some internal logic, some organizing principle that made sense only to him. He worked at this for hours at a time, with the focused, deliberate attention of a craftsman. Subject 4 stopped using the toilet. The researchers noted this with alarm and attempted via intercom to understand why. Subject 4 did not respond to their queries. He simply continued to exist in the chamber, managing his body's functions in a way that suggested he had, somewhere in the past few days, stopped considering his body as something that required management, as something distinct from the environment around it. Subject 5 began singing, quietly, under his breath, the same phrase repeated over and over. A folk song, the researchers determined, a children's song about a river and a fox. He sang it continuously for 31 hours. Then he stopped and never sang again. But it was Subject 3 who frightened the researchers most. He had been the one to speak, "We are what you made us," and since that statement, he had returned to silence. But he was not passive. He was watching. Every time a researcher appeared at the observation window, Subject 3 was already looking at it, not at the window itself, but at the person behind it, through it, as if the glass were not there, as if the wall were not there, as if the distance between him and the observer were simply a convention he had decided to stop respecting. The lead researcher noted in a personal log, not the official file, a personal notebook that was only discovered decades later, that being observed by Subject 3 through the window felt, in his words, like being read, like being understood completely and found to be very, very small. On the 18th day, the situation in the chamber became acute. Subject 2, who had screamed and then returned to apparent calm, was found by the sensors to have stopped moving entirely. Not sleeping, the monitoring equipment could distinguish between sleep and stillness, and this was stillness. He was alive. His heart was beating. He was breathing. But he had become, for all practical purposes, inert. A researcher who checked the chamber window described him as looking like someone who had decided something. What he had decided, they did not yet know. That night, if it could be called night, given the artificial lighting in the chamber, Subject 1, who had been arranging his paper strips, suddenly began eating them. Again, methodically, strip by strip. The researchers watched this through the observation window and did not know what to do. It was not immediately harmful. He was not invisible distress. He was simply eating paper, with the focused, practical air of a man consuming a meal he has decided is adequate. The food in the chamber had barely been touched since day 12. Subject 4 had begun to exhibit another behavior that the researchers found difficult to document without their language beginning to fail them. He was spending increasing amounts of time very close to the chamber walls, not leaning against them, not pressing himself to them, but standing approximately 3 inches away from the surface, his face turned toward it, motionless. The researchers could not determine what he was looking at. There was nothing on the wall. It was a blank surface, slightly damp from condensation, institutional gray. He would stand there for hours, then step away, do something briefly purposeful, eat a small amount, use a corner of the room, adjust his clothing, and return. One of the younger researchers watching on the overnight shift wrote in his personal account, published much later, "I had the irrational but overwhelming conviction that he was listening to something coming through the wall, something we couldn't hear." On day 20, the researchers made a decision. One of the subjects, they do not specify which in the official record, had approached the microphone and made a request. A specific, coherent, articulately stated request, the first such communication from the chamber in nearly a week. What he asked for was simple enough. He wanted the researchers to turn off the gas. He did not say why. He did not say what he thought would happen if they did. He simply stated in a voice the monitoring technician described as completely flat, completely certain, like someone reading a number, that the gas should be turned off. The lead researcher, listening from the monitoring room, asked, "Are you in pain?" The reply came immediately, "We stopped being in pain a long time ago." That's the problem. The gas was not turned off. Here's where the official record becomes inconsistent. The Soviet researchers were meticulous. That much is clear from the volumes of observational data, the physiological readings, the movement logs. But between day 21 and day 25, there are gaps. Periods of hours, sometimes approaching a full day, where the records show nothing. No observational notes, no sensor data, no monitoring logs. Just blank space where the documentation should be. There are two explanations for this. The first is bureaucratic. Perhaps equipment failed, perhaps shifts overlapped poorly, perhaps the sheer cumulative horror of what they were watching caused the researchers to, collectively and unconsciously, simply stop writing things down. The second explanation, which is the one that the partial personal accounts seem to support, is that the researchers stopped watching. That what they saw in the chamber between those days was bad enough that they chose, by informal consensus, not to look. What we know from the records that do exist is this. By day 22, Subject 2 had not moved in approximately 4 days. He was alive, sensors confirmed this, but he had achieved a state of stillness so complete that the researchers began discussing, in their monitoring sessions, whether he had somehow developed a method of sleeping that the gas could not suppress, whether he had found a way through. But he wasn't sleeping. The EG readings, crude by modern standards but functional, showed continuous, low-level brain activity. He was awake. He was simply choosing not to move. By day 23, Subjects 1 and 4 had apparently stopped sleeping at all. Not because of the gas, or not only because of the gas, but because they seemed to have lost the ability to transition into unconsciousness. They would lie on their cots, and the monitoring equipment would track their brainwaves, and their brainwaves would never change, never shift into the slower rhythms associated with sleep. They were trapped in wakefulness, the way a record needle is trapped in a groove, circling endlessly. Subject 5 had stopped singing days ago. Now he did something else. He prayed. Continuously, under his breath, the same prayer repeated with the mechanical regularity of a machine. The researchers identified it as an orthodox prayer for the dead, a prayer traditionally spoken at funerals, over bodies. He was praying for the dead, alone in a sealed room, with 4 other living men around him. He was praying for himself. And Subject 3. Subject 3 was doing something that the researchers could observe but not explain, something that appears in the surviving notes with a phrase that translates roughly as self-organized tissue damage. He was hurting himself, slowly, deliberately, without apparent distress, methodically, the same way Subject 1 had organized his paper strips, the same way Subject 4 had stood at the wall, with purpose, with something that looked horrifyingly like concentration. When the researcher's intercom crackled to life and Subject 3's voice came through, steady, unhurried, as if discussing the weather, he told them what he was doing. He explained it clearly. The explanation has been redacted from the official document. The historian who first read the unredacted version said, in the brief account he gave before refusing to speak further, that the explanation was internally coherent, that it made sense in a terrible way, given everything Subject 3 had experienced in the previous 3 weeks, that it was the most frightening thing he had ever read, more frightening than the action itself, because the action, he said, you could attribute to madness. But the explanation was not mad. The explanation was, in its way, reasonable. On day 25, the monitoring equipment recorded a sound from inside the chamber that no one present could immediately identify. It was low frequency. It lasted approximately 40 seconds, and it came simultaneously from all 5 subjects. They were not in the same area of the room. They could not see each other clearly. There was no signal that the researchers could detect. But all 5 of them produced the sound at the same moment, sustained it for the same duration, and stopped at the same moment. When a researcher asked, via intercom, what the sound was, what it meant, what they were communicating, Subject 3 answered. "We weren't communicating," he said. "We were agreeing." No one asked what they were agreeing to. On day 30, the researchers made a decision. This was the scheduled end of the experiment. The agreed upon date. The date by which, according to the terms of the prisoners' agreement, they were to be released. The lead researcher submitted a request to continue the experiment for another 15 days. The request was denied, not on humanitarian grounds, but because the military brass reviewing the project had become alarmed by the reports they were receiving and wanted to assess the subjects directly. And so the order came, open the chamber. The team that prepared for the extraction wore protective gear, gas masks, and biohazard suits, a precaution the lead researcher insisted on, though he struggled in his notes to articulate exactly what he feared. The gas in the chamber was not dangerous to properly equipped personnel. The subjects were, technically, unarmed. There were 5 of them, all of whom had been visibly weakened by 30 days of almost no sleep and inadequate nutrition. There was no rational reason to expect serious resistance. The researchers were frightened anyway. Later accounts suggest that several of them had requested sidearms and been denied. The chamber door was unsealed. The heavy bolts were withdrawn. The lead researcher and 2 colleagues entered first. What they found does not agree in its details between the several surviving accounts. This is not unusual for traumatic events. Memory distorts, perception filters, the mind protects itself. But the accounts agree on the broad outline. And the broad outline is this. The chamber smelled of something that no one who was there could accurately describe, but that multiple accounts compare inadequately to copper and to something else, something organic and wrong. The lighting inside the chamber, which had been fluorescent and steady for 30 days, now flickered irregularly, though the power connection had not been disrupted. 3 of the subjects were visible immediately. One, not specified which, was standing in the center of the room, watching the door. He had been watching it, the researchers would later understand, for some time before it opened. He had known, or predicted, or decided that it would open today. He was smiling. The researchers' notes described the smile very carefully. It was not a smile of relief, not a smile of welcome, not even the distorted, involuntary smile that extreme sleep deprivation sometimes produces in subjects. It was described, repeatedly, as intentional, as if it had been prepared, as if he had thought about what expression to wear when the door opened and had chosen this one. "It was the smile," wrote one researcher, "of someone who has learned something terrible and is deciding whether to tell you." One subject was in a far corner of the chamber and did not move when the door opened, did not look up. He was alive, breathing was audible, but he remained perfectly still. He remained perfectly still for the entire duration of the extraction process. He had to be physically moved. When the researchers touched him to move him, he made no response at all. Not resistance, not cooperation, simply nothing. He moved the way furniture moves. The 3rd visible subject, Subject 3, the one who had been hurting himself, was crouching near the chamber wall. He was examining something on the floor with close attention. When the lead researcher approached him and spoke his name, Subject 3 looked up. His eyes were, according to the account, entirely clear. "The most focused eyes I have ever seen on a human being." He said, "You should close the door. You really should close the door. You're going to regret opening it." The lead researcher asked, "Are you injured?" Subject 3 looked at him for a long moment with those clear, focused eyes, and then said something that has appeared in every account of this event, that the historian who read the original document called the most disturbing sentence in the file. "Injured means you wanted to stop. I stopped wanting things to stop a long time ago. I want to see what comes after. The fourth subject was found in the washroom. What he had done in the washroom is described in the official record in clinical language. It is described in the personal accounts in language that is not clinical at all, and from which I will spare you the specific details. He was alive. He should not, medically, have been alive. When the medical personnel examined him, they could not determine how he was continuing to function. He was, by every physiological measure they applied, in a state that should have been incompatible with consciousness. But he was conscious. His eyes tracked movement. He responded, not with words, but with sounds when spoken to. Subject 2, the one who had been completely still since day 18, was on his cot, exactly where he had been when the sensors last tracked him moving. He was lying on his back. His eyes were open. He was staring at the ceiling with the same fixed, deliberate attention that Subject 4 had given to the wall. He was dead. He had been dead, the medical examiner would later estimate, for approximately 16 hours. His heart had stopped sometime in the early hours of day 30, while the researchers on the overnight shift had, for reasons that none of them satisfactorily explained, failed to notice, or had noticed and had not entered it in the log. This is the part of the story that no dramatization has ever gotten quite right, because the most disturbing thing about what happened when the chamber was opened was not the condition of the subjects. It was not the state of the room. It was not even what they had done to themselves in the dark, alone, over 30 days without sleep. It was what they asked for. The 3 living mobile subjects, the ones capable of communication, capable of articulating requests, made demands of the researchers almost immediately after the chamber was opened. These demands were, on the surface, specific and coherent. They knew what they wanted. They could explain what they wanted. They communicated it clearly, without apparent confusion or distress. Subject 1, who had eaten the paper strips, who had arranged his strange patterns on the floor, who had barely consumed actual food in 2 weeks. Subject 1 asked to be returned to the chamber, not to a hospital, not to his original prison, to the chamber. He said he was not finished. When the lead researcher asked what he meant, not finished with what, Subject 1 described, with clinical detachment, a process he believed he was in the middle of, something he had been working on in the dark over the past 30 days, something he said had almost reached completion and that he needed to continue. He described this process in terms that the researchers found difficult to categorize. It was not psychotic language, not the fragmented, associative speech of a person who has lost contact with reality. It was organized, sequential, internally consistent. It described something he believed was happening to him, or in him, or through him, that could not be interrupted without consequence. Subject 3 made a different request. He asked for a pen and paper. The researchers, off balance, provided both. Subject 3 sat down on the floor of the corridor and began writing. He wrote for approximately 2 hours, continuously, without stopping, without appearing to think, the pen moving across the page with the automatic certainty of someone transcribing rather than composing. When he handed the pages to the lead researcher, they contained what he described as everything I have understood. The contents of those pages are not in any file currently accessible. The official record notes that they were reviewed by 3 senior researchers and then destroyed on orders from Moscow. The lead researcher, in his private journal, wrote only, "I read them, I wish I had not. They are not the words of a madman. That is the problem. They are the words of someone who has been somewhere we have not been and seen something we have not seen. Whether what he saw is real is a question I am no longer qualified to answer." The 4th surviving mobile subject, Subject 4, the one who had stood at the wall, made the strangest request of all. He did not ask for the chamber. He did not ask for paper. He asked simply for quiet. Not in the sense of silence. The corridor they were in was already relatively quiet. He meant something else. He meant something internal. He described, again with the eerie coherence that characterized all three subjects' communication in these moments, a state of noise that had developed inside his mind over the past several days. Not auditory hallucination. He was precise about this. Not voices. Something more fundamental. A constant, low-level signal, like the hum of a machine that can never be turned off. He said the gas had done something to the way he processed being conscious. That consciousness for him was no longer a background condition, but a foreground one, something he was aware of constantly, the way you are aware of a very bright light in a very dark room. And the awareness was loud. It was loud, and it would not stop, and he needed it to stop. "You gave me too much wakefulness," he said. "I can't find the edge of it anymore." He made this request quietly, politely, with the dignity of a man at a formal meeting. Then he sat down on the floor, closed his eyes, and appeared to wait. He was still waiting when the medical personnel arrived to transport him. What none of the three subjects asked for: release, medical treatment, to see their families, to have the terms of their original agreement honored, to be given the pardons they had been promised. None of them, apparently, considered these things worth requesting. The lead researcher, in what may be the most quietly devastating line in his private journal, wrote, "They are no longer interested in the things that people are interested in. Whatever they were interested in instead, I could not determine. But it was absorbing. It was completely absorbing. I have never seen three people so entirely elsewhere, while still being physically present." Here is what the official Soviet record says happened next. The three living subjects were transferred to a secure medical facility for observation and treatment. They were given food, appropriate medical care, monitored continuously. They recovered. They were eventually released or transferred to prison. Or, the record is not clear, something else. The experiment was concluded. Its findings were classified. The chamber was decommissioned. Here is what the unofficial accounts say. The three living subjects did not recover. Not in any meaningful sense of that word. Subject 1, who wanted to return to the chamber, who believed he was in the middle of something, was transferred to a psychiatric facility. He continued, in his cell, to arrange objects in the patterns he had developed in the chamber. He continued not sleeping, or barely sleeping, for months after his removal from the gas. He continued asking regularly and politely to be returned. He died 3 years after the experiment, of causes listed as systemic failure, a classification so vague as to be meaningless. He was 31 years old. Subject 3, who had written the pages, never wrote anything after handing over those sheets in the corridor. He spoke very little. When he did speak, he spoke in a way that his attendants described as if translating, as if the thoughts were occurring in a language that wasn't quite Russian or quite language, and he was rendering them into something communicable, imperfectly, losing meaning at every step. He died 4 years after the experiment. He was 28 years old. Subject 4, who had asked for quiet, reportedly achieved it. Not through treatment, not through recovery, not through any medical intervention. Simply, over a period of months, the noise he described became something he could manage, then something he could ignore, then something that was no longer there. By 2 years after the experiment, Subject 4 was, by most observable measures, a functional human being. He ate. He slept. Finally, he slept. He could hold a conversation. He had a memory of the experiment that he could discuss, if asked, in the flat, factual way that survivors of terrible things sometimes describe them. What he could not do, apparently, was feel anything about it. Not shock, not horror, not guilt, not grief, not even the numb absence that passes for feeling in the aftermath of trauma. Asked by a researcher how he felt about what had happened, the experiment, the chamber, the 30 days, he reportedly considered the question for a long moment, with what the researcher described as genuine effort, genuinely trying to locate an answer. Then he said, "I understand the question. I don't have the part that answers it anymore. He was released eventually, the only one of the three to be released and to remain, in the administrative sense, free. He lived an apparently ordinary life, got a job, had neighbors, never spoke of the experiment publicly. He died in 1979. He was 61 years old. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure, which is ordinary enough. The note found in his apartment afterward was brief. It was addressed to no one. It said, in full, 30 days was enough to see it. I have spent 30 years trying to forget what it looked like. I think the problem is that it didn't look like anything bad. I think the problem is that it looked like understanding. The chamber was sealed. The gas formula was reclassified. The lead researcher died in 1953, the same year as Stalin, of causes that may or may not have been natural. His private journals were found in 2002. When his daughter opened a locked chest, he had specifically instructed her not to open until 20 years after his death. She waited exactly 20 years, then opened it. She has never said what was in the journals beyond the passages quoted here. She has never explained why, the week after she opened the chest, she donated almost her entire inheritance to a foundation working on sleep research. She has never given interviews. She has never indicated whether she believes the experiment happened as described. She has, by all accounts, been unable to sleep without medication since the day she opened her father's chest. The Soviet sleep experiment exists in a strange space between history and legend. The documents are real. The archive references are real. The era and context, Stalin's Soviet Union, black budget research programs, political prisoners used as experimental subjects, are real, historically verified, well documented. The NKVD and its successor agencies ran experiments that modern ethics would consider unthinkable, and they ran them on people who had no recourse and no voice and no protection. What is disputed, what cannot be definitively resolved from available evidence, is whether this specific experiment happened in the way the documents describe, whether the gas existed, whether the subjects responded as recorded, whether what the researchers observed was real or interpreted through the lens of their own fear and exhaustion and the particular madness of watching human beings deteriorate in real time. Sleep deprivation is genuinely, documentably terrifying. We know this. After 11 days, which is the longest verified duration of deliberate wakefulness in controlled research settings, human beings begin to experience symptoms that look, from the outside, like psychosis, hallucinations, paranoid thinking, the dissolution of the boundary between self and not self. The brain, denied its nightly maintenance cycle, begins to malfunction in ways that are vivid and catastrophic. But what the Soviet experiment describes goes beyond that, goes beyond anything the research literature, even now, can fully account for. What the subjects seem to have experienced, if the accounts are accurate, is not psychosis in the conventional sense, not the random misfiring of an overloaded system. Something more organized, something that had, as Subject 3's impossible pages suggested, logic. And that is the question that haunts this story, the question that the lead researcher was circling in his private journal when he wrote that the contents of those pages were not the words of a madman. What if the sleep deprivation didn't break their minds? What if it opened them? What if consciousness, forced to operate without the daily reset of sleep, without the nightly editing and consolidation and forgetting that sleep provides, eventually reaches some kind of saturation point? What if at that saturation point, stripped of everything that makes it manageable and human scale, consciousness becomes something else, not less than it was, something other than it was, something that can perceive clearly, that can understand fully, that is in fact more aware than anything a normally sleeping person experiences, but that is not compatible with being a person anymore. Subject 4 said he had been given too much wakefulness and couldn't find the edge of it. Subject 3 said he wanted to know what comes after. Subject 1 said he wasn't finished with whatever he had started in the dark. What if they were right? What if there is something on the other side of sleep deprivation? Not madness, not death, not recovery, but a third thing. A thing we don't have a name for. And 5 men in a Soviet chamber in 1947 found their way to the beginning of it. What if the only reason we don't know more is that the researchers closed the file, sealed the chamber, and burned the pages, because whatever they saw was not the failure of the human mind. Because it was the opposite. The file is still partially classified .v, not by Russia, officially post-Soviet declassification, has released most NKVD materials from this era. But certain sections of the experiment's documentation remain, for reasons that are either bureaucratic or deliberate, unavailable. The 4 pages Subject 3 wrote in the corridor have never been found. The formula for the gas has not been independently confirmed. The specific identities of all 5 subjects have never been released. And somewhere, in a Moscow archive or a researcher's private collection or a database no one has thought to check, there may be footage. The chamber was equipped with recording equipment. 30 days of recordings were made. The recordings are listed in the experimental log as existing. They are not listed as having been destroyed. They are simply listed as unreviewed. 30 days of footage from inside a sealed chamber where 5 men were kept awake beyond any limit the human body was designed to withstand. 30 days of footage that includes day 25, when all 5 subjects made a sound together that no one has ever adequately described. That includes whatever Subject 3 was doing to himself in the final days and his explanation for it. That includes the hours where the researchers stop watching and the records go blank. That footage exists, or it existed somewhere. Maybe someone has watched it and decided, like the lead researcher's daughter with her father's chest, that certain knowledge is its own kind of damage. Maybe it's still sitting in a box with a handwritten label, waiting for someone with a strong enough stomach and a high enough clearance to press play. Maybe the reason no one has pressed play is that Subject 3 was right. You should close the door. You really should close the door. You're going to regret opening it. Maybe the wisdom of that warning applies as much to what we know as to what we don't. But then again, 30 days without sleep. 5 men in a sealed room. Whatever they understood in the dark. Whatever they agreed to. Don't you want to know? The Soviet sleep experiment. Real experiment, real archive. 30 days, 5 men. Whatever they found in the dark, they weren't willing to leave it behind. And somewhere, there's footage of every minute of it, unreviewed. Waiting. If you found this story disturbing, that was the point. Subscribe to Forgotten Horrors. Leave a comment telling me, would you watch the tape? I know I wouldn't. I think that's the right answer. I'm not sure anymore.